Welcome to your first quilting tutorial. This is a great spot to land if you're interested in learning how to make a quilt for the first time and you've never done this before. The purpose of this tutorial is to help guide you through this project, which is a simple patchwork baby quilt with all the steps that you need to make it from start to finish, and it assumes that you've never done this before. Now you will need to know the bare basics of using your sewing machine. Here I'm using the Singer Quantum Stylist 9960. This is a quilting sewing machine, but it's also a mid-level sewing machine. So even though it's digital and it's made for quilters, it's also pretty basic to work your way around. So this should be easy, and everything that I describe should pretty much translate to whatever sewing machine that you're working on. Now I'm going to take you step by step through this project, and to make this as simple as possible, I bought everything that I need for this project at Walmart. The entire cost for the whole project was about $20 for all of the materials, and I do have similar comparable items that you can find on Amazon listed on each lesson if you need supplies. But this is all basic craft supply store stuff, and I would recommend that for a first project, you spend as little as possible so that it's just more forgiving if you need to go back and remake anything or replace some supplies. Now there's also a dedicated forum thread in a link below each video where you can post pictures of your progress, or you can ask any questions, or if there's anything that you need me to clarify in any of my descriptions, you can also post that right there. I do like to keep the questions open for everyone to read, and that would be for anyone who might have the same question. Or if you want to answer a question in a way that's better than I can, you're welcome to do that as well. There are lots of ways to do things, and everyone is welcome to add in their comments or thoughts. So keep your eye out for that link just before this set of lessons. And with that, we can get started on the first part of this lesson. Welcome to your first tutorial on quilt making. I'm using the Fat Quarter bundle from Walmart in this project. This is called the Hootsie bundle, and you only need one of these to make the front panel of your baby quilt. And we're going to cut these into 6-inch squares, and I'm going to show you how to prepare these pieces to build your front panel. Now, if you want to skip this part, you can buy these squares already pre-cut in the form of little charm packs, but they usually come already cut in 5-inch squares. So if you want to use the charm packs, follow the same directions for this quilt, and just know that your baby quilt will be just a little bit smaller. Preparing our pieces. So let's take a look at our fat quarters. We're going to cut these just like we would with any fabric right off the bolt. And it's worth noting that my fat quarter pieces in this case are 18 by 21 inches. So I'm going to end up getting 9 squares that are 6 inches apiece per fat quarter piece. Overall, for our pattern, we need a total of 42 squares. And so these 5 variations in my bundle are going to end up giving me 45 squares. So we have plenty of fabric to work with. So let's get these cut up. In front of me, I have my 5 fat quarter pieces, a cutting mat, a rotary cutter, and I have a 6-inch square ruler. Now there are a variety of rulers that you can use that would be suitable for just cutting this up. You could get a long rectangular ruler. There are squares of multiple sizes. I happen to have a 6-inch square, and we're going to be cutting these into 6-inch pieces, so this is perfect. This 18 by 21 inch piece, again, it's going to give me 9 squares. So I'm just going to measure each one out, and every time I'm going to cut into this corner piece, I'm going to make sure that these corners are perfectly square. And then I'm going to do this with all 45 pieces. Once these are all cut out, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to arrange these so that they are evenly arranged in my pattern. We're going to be putting this into 6 columns by 7 rows. And I want to lay these out first to make sure that the colors look satisfying, that everything's evenly dispersed, and that there aren't any blocks with the same print touching each other. So I'm going to lay this right out on my floor behind my sewing table, and I'll arrange my pieces. And when I get them exactly how I like them, I'm going to take my phone and snap a photo, and that's just in case later on things end up getting shuffled around. If I do get confused or I do get things misplaced, I'll be able to put everything back exactly the way I wanted it. So this is just a helpful resource for later. Chain piecing the first pieces. Now I want to bring this over to the sewing machine, so I'll have to carefully place these into piles in a way that makes sense. So imagine that we're going to split this layout into 3 columns with 2 side-by-side squares per column. I'm going to take the square on the right and fold it over the square on the left. Make sure that the right side of the fabric are facing inward and the wrong side is facing outward. Now this might not make a difference with a solid fabric, but with my flannel prints, you can clearly see which side is the right side and which side is the wrong side. So what we need to remember is that the right edge of this square is the middle of our column. And we're going to sew each one of these on the right side. Now I'm going to stack these from the top to the bottom. The top square is going to be on the top of the pile. So if I number these squares 1 through 7, then 1 is on the top of my pile and 7 is on the bottom. I'm going to immediately label this as my first column and set it next to my sewing machine, and then I'm going to do the same thing with the other 2 columns, and I'm going to get them labeled as well. So now I'm sitting at my sewing machine and I have 3 piles of squares labeled 1, 2, and 3. And now we're going to take these squares and chain piece them together in the first step. Now as we're sitting here in front of the machine, remember, this is a beginner tutorial, and if you're watching this and you need to know how to thread and set up your machine, then go back to the previous tutorial and learn how to thread your machine from there. For this project, you can use any thread color that you like. It can be dark, it could be light, just preferably something that will complement or match the fabric that you've picked out. So we're going to take our fabric and we're taking our first pair of squares from the top of the pile. And remember, everything's going to be sewn on the right side. So I want to double check that this is lined up as perfectly as I can get it. And I'm going to measure this on my machine with a seam that has 1/4 of an inch. So right here on my machine, I have a little ruler plate that I'm going to look for the 1-4 or 1/4, which is usually the closest marking to your presser foot. Now pay attention here, I'm using the base foot that the machine came with. This is also called my piecing foot, and it fits a 1/4 inch seam perfectly. So I'm going to line the fabric up with my 1/4 inch mark on the plate, lower the foot, and sew this through. Now when we get to the end, don't cut anything, don't move the fabric, just allow the needle to rotate just a few extra stitches, lift the presser foot, and line up the next block of fabric. So this one is the next block on the pile, this is number 2, and I'm going to line this up exactly the same as I did the first one, and then sew this through. Now that you can see what we're doing, I'm going to continue to do this with all 7 pieces of fabric, and I'm going to keep running them through all the way down until they're all chained together, hence chain piecing, because we're never cutting the thread. Now when I'm ready to remove this from the machine, we are going to cut these apart, but just note that we have everything in order. So start from the bottom, and just remember, this one is at the bottom of the pile. So cut number 7 and then put it down, cut number 6 and place it on top, cut 5 and place it on top, and stack these until you get to the first one. Now place the label on it, and then we're going to go and we're going to do columns 2 and 3 in exactly the same way. Piecing the rows together. Now once these are finished, I'm going to line them up in order, and then I'm going to take the top piece from each pile and open them up and lay them side by side. Here we're going to take columns 1 and 2 and lay them on top of each other like we did with the first ones. And I'm going to sew the right sides together. I'm going to cut this and then open it up, and I'm going to place the third column at the end on top of the second column and line up the right side again and sew this through. Now I have my first row complete. Now I'm going to set this aside, and ideally I'll start to lay everything out on a table, but you might not have that much space. If you don't have a floor space or a full table to work on, you can stack these rows, but be sure to keep your rows in order. In this case, if we stack these, your top row is going to be on the bottom of your stack. So just make sure that you remember the order you placed everything. For me, I'm going to put this right back on my floor, and I'm going to keep everything in a visual order. So now I'm going to repeat what I did with the first row 6 more times. So just as a review, I'm taking columns 1 and 2 and laying them face to face and sewing down the right side. Then I open it up and lay column 3 on top of that, and we're going to sew down the right side again. Cut this, and then lay the row down below the first row. Now I'm going to do this for all the rest of the pieces. Sewing the rows together. Now before we go forward and sew the rows together, we want to prepare the rows first. To do that, I'm going to iron the rows so that the seams are all facing the same way, and then we can prepare to nest them evenly. So the way we do this is I'm going to start with the bottom row, and I'm going to bring it over to my ironing pad. I'm going to press these in the direction that I want them to go, and it can be either way. It doesn't matter. They can go to the left, they can go to the right, but what does matter is that I want all of the seams to go in the same direction. Now for the next row, which is row 6, I'm going to do the same thing, but I want these seams to go in the opposite direction. So I'll iron these down, and then eventually we're going to get these nested into the right position. With row 5, this is the same, and the seams are going to go the opposite again. And I'm going to iron all of the rows and alternate the seams on each row all the way to the top to row 1. Now the reason for this is that when we sew these together, the seams will be locked into their places, and our squares are going to have a nice looking crisp corner to them. And this will prevent the corners from pulling to one side or from looking a little bit blurred. Now just make sure that you remember where the top and the bottom rows are. By the time you've rearranged these rows, they've flipped once or twice, so be sure to keep track of rows 1 and rows 7. Use your picture if you need to. In my case, I have everything laid out, so everything stays in the same order, but make sure to keep track if you're stacking these on top of one another. Now before we sew these together, we want to line these seams up as closely and perfectly as we can. So I always pin these at the seam. So I'm going to take rows 1 and 2 and I'm going to pin them together. And I'm going to carefully match the seams as I pin them in. Now remember, one seam is going one way and the other seam is going the other way. So when these meet, they're going to lock together, and you can wiggle them and feel them between your fingers that they're butted up just perfectly and both of the seams fit together very snugly. This is what we mean when we say that these seams are being nested together. So when you feel that these are snug, go ahead and put a pin right in that spot. And then once you've finished putting all of your pins all the way down the row, line this up in your machine, and remember, we're still using a 1/4 inch seam, so that's exactly the same as all of the other sewing that you've done so far. And feed the row through slowly. But just before you get to the seam, make sure that you do remove the pin. Hold the seam down with your fingers and just allow it to go through. Be sure that you don't go over the pins with your needle. If the needle hits the pin, you could break the needle, and even if that seems like it's very unlikely, it's really only a matter of time if you have enough pins in your project. So don't be in the habit of letting your needle run over your pins. Flying broken projectiles are not a part of this project. Now when we're done, let's take a look at our corners. If we lined everything up and nested our seams, we should have nice clean corners. But if your corners aren't perfect, don't worry. Sometimes this takes just a little bit of practice, and sometimes the corners, they just don't match perfectly, and that's just the way it's going to turn out. That's just how it is sometimes. So don't think too much about it, and definitely don't worry about it. We're just going to keep going and keep pushing forward even if your corners are a little bit off. Now we'll take the third row and place it over the second row, and I'm going to match the squares and nest the seams and place my pins where I want them to go. And I'm going to carefully run this through the sewing machine. And once we're done with this, I still have to do it 4 more times, and then once we've completed that, we have our finished quilt top. Ironing the quilt top. Now before we finish this part of the tutorial, I want to give this one more press. So I'm going to take the entire piece over to my ironing pad, and I'm going to turn it on its face so that the seams are facing me. I'm going to press the seams in the direction that it wants to lie down, because these only meet in a 4-way intersection, so it's really not too complicated. So we can just press these seams down and we won't expect it to bunch up too much. Now just take a note that I'm not running the iron over the fabric so that we're not stretching it and moving it. When we do this, we're just pressing a little bit and then lift. It's just a press and lift. And I'm going to do this all the way across the seams, and once everything is clean and pressed, we have a perfect little baby quilt top. And we're ready to move on to the next step.